Hello, and welcome to another episode of Twice as Hard. I am here today with Dana Brownlee. She is a writer, a speaker, and president of Professionalism Matters, an ATL based training company. Dana, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you with me.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me and to join me in this conversation. You know, when we connected on LinkedIn with a few of the recent articles that you were writing, Dana's also a senior contributing writer at Forbes. We touched base around some of the issues that Black women are experiencing in the workplace, and I was really happy that you asked me to kind of write for that piece, that you wanted to kind of eliminate some of the experiences we have with code switching. And I thought, further to that, some of the experiences that we have just growing up, that notion that we have to work twice as hard has really just reared its head in my life in so many ways. And I just wanted to kind of demystify that or confirm it. I don't know. What has been your experience? Have you had to battle with this notion that you've had to be twice as hard and twice as good over your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's unfortunate, but I think that most Black people, certainly of my generation, I mean, I'm 50. And so oftentimes in the media, they're talking about the conversations that Black parents are having with their sons as it relates to police and what to do if you're, pulled over and how to comport yourself, et cetera. But I think that extends into almost every walk of life. I mean, I remember as if it were yesterday, I went to Spelman and Georgia Tech and Emory, and those are very different experiences. But I remember distinctly that as I was going through the career management process and interviewing for positions, both after undergrad and then also after graduate school, that certainly there were things that were spoken and there were things that were unspoken. Things that were very explicit, were around, your hair, your nails, your tone, how you present yourself, your clothes, all of those things. But then I think there's also this other layer that is somewhat unspoken, but very much felt, that clearly we live, just as Isabel Wilkerson brilliantly talked about in caste, we live in a bit of a caste system. Mm-hmm. And in the corporate world, I think there are multiple layers of that caste system. But either way, we understand that it was constructed so that Black women and Indigenous women are at the bottom. However you want to splice it, we know that whether it's, through gender discrimination or racial discrimination, that we do carry a much heavier backpack. And so as a result of that, we have to compensate, and so we need to get multiple degrees. We need to be at the top of our class. We need to talk a certain way, look a certain way. We need to not make white people feel uncomfortable. So there's a laundry list of things that we certainly, and I can't speak for all Black women, certainly, but just in my own life experience and my professional experience, certainly we feel that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say, to a large extent, that notion that we have to be twice as good, it's both within and without, right? Like it comes from within, right? That drive, that personal drive we have to achieve and to do more and to do better, almost because we know inherently that we have to do these things in order to make it, like you said, in corporate. How would you say that notion has helped you over your career, that you've had to be twice as good?
Yeah, I think in some ways there are benefits to it. You're driven. I mean, you're absolutely driven. You get like my parents, perfect example, both my parents had PhDs. Both my parents had PhDs when they were growing up. I think that they certainly felt that. In fact, one of the first interviews I did on my series was interviewing my mom and talking to her about growing up in Jim Crow South and what that was like. And one of the things that she said that stuck out to me, which really pierced me because I could relate to it so much, because I asked her about what the perceptions were, how she felt being a Black person in a society that devalued Blackness, like explicitly, like in the law, like not even like what we're talking about. Yes. And she said she always knew that she felt like she was supposed to achieve less. She knew that she was supposed to feel inferior. Even though she didn't really feel inferior, she knew that she was supposed to feel inferior. And so I think for me, a lot of that has been fairly similar. It's like, you know, you're in the room, you know that the expectations are lowered, you know that, or they have lower expectations, because those can connote different things. They have lower expectations, you know, the level of grace or room for error is much smaller. In many ways, you feel like you're representing an entire race of people. And it's just more difficult. You know, oftentimes it is just very, very much more difficult. There's some organizations or environments that are outright toxic, and you can feel that, and that's palpable. There's certain organizations and environments that mean well, but structurally are just not configured for you to maybe have the same advantage that other people may have. So going back to the original, you know, question, I think the benefit of it is, I think it forced me to be very, very driven. Yes. To go back, get multiple degrees, be at the top of my class, you know, start a company, just outwork everybody. Like I literally remember one of my first jobs was at AT&T, and I literally remember that I was like the only person on the floor who knew, because the lights would go off after a certain hour, but I knew where to go to turn the lights back on. And I was like, why am I the only one? Like I was coming in on Saturdays, I was coming in on the weekends. And a lot of that probably was self-imposed. A lot of that probably was me feeling like I couldn't make a mistake. Right. Like I needed to be the best. And so I think it shows up in a lot of different ways.
I want to ask you more about your mom, right? And that, like you said, that she needed to feel inferior, or she knew
she was supposed to feel inferior. Yeah.
And I feel
that really hit me.
It hit me too when you said that. And it feels like to a certain extent that notion could have trickled down, but you did note that your parents both have PhDs. So despite the fact that she knew the expectations of her in the world were that she should feel inferior, your mother still went on and pursued higher education. So I guess speak to me a little bit about that, and then the impact of that on your life.
Yeah, I think that culturally, many Black people understood really clearly that education was the way out. You know, my parents told me very clearly they didn't have many vocational options. They didn't have friends to call up when I wanted to do an internship. You know, they didn't have friends who were lawyers and judges and who, you know, worked at major companies and could, you know, write me a letter of recommendation. You know, they didn't have all that. My mom said, you know, when I was growing up, you could be a nurse, a preacher, or a teacher. You know, that was about it. You know, those were our options. Those were our choices. But, you know, she's a brilliant person. She skipped 2 grades and graduated at 16. My mother became the superintendent of the school district that I graduated from in Columbia, South Carolina. She actually was not, when she was a child, she couldn't attend the University of South Carolina. Then fast forward decades later, she became one of, if not the first Black female tenured full professor at the University of South Carolina. So, you know, I think that part of the frustration when we look at, you know, issues like reparations and all these other things, so many of us in our families, we can look back at our uncles, our cousins, our aunts. There's so many people who should have been a lawyer, you know, but they're a manager at Applebee's, you know, who, you know, would have been. I mean, they're brilliant people who just simply did not have the opportunity as a result of race. So for her, I mean, clearly she's a brilliant person. She was, you know, and so she still had that drive. The other thing that I think kind of helped protect her was she lived in a very rural environment. And this was kind of the benefit of segregation. I'm sure a lot of people that generation will talk about that. When they were in that little cocoon, you know, they were amongst other Black people. She didn't really see white people. Everything was segregated. So it really wasn't until much later in life that she interacted with white people with any regularity. I remember my husband talking about, because he grew up in the south side of Chicago. He was like, he didn't really see white people until he went to Disney World for the first time.
Wow.
So there was that benefit where if you're in an environment that is completely Black, I was going to say Black and brown, but really Black, where, you know, your doctor and your postman and your teachers and your, you know, everybody kind of looked like you, you kind of had the ability to not focus on that or not think about that. Now, their parents were hyper aware. In fact, my mother also talked to me when I was interviewing her that time. She said she saw her father, who was a leader in the community. He was a preacher, but he had a master's degree. He was also a principal of a school, which was kind of unheard of at the time. But she said if they would get pulled over by a policeman, he would turn into like a little boy. And clearly there was that fear of white people. So she understood they were very, very fearful of white people, but there wasn't much discussion about that. So I think that she had this cocoon of support and love within the Black community. So she didn't necessarily have to be burdened by that as a child. So she excelled. And so, you know, I think once she learned more about racism and once she understood the way the environment or society was set up, I think that just made her more driven.
Yeah, I think a lot of cases with a lot of women that I speak to, you know, we as Black women, we excel despite the conditions around us, partly because we have to, partly because, you know, it's been conditioned and ingrained in us that we need to do these things to be better than, or we won't, you know, we won't achieve the things that we necessarily want to. We won't be able to support or sustain our families. And so I want to talk about now, I guess, a little bit, sometimes the ways in which that notion that we need to be twice as hard and twice as good, how does that hurt us? Because it's not always helpful to be that driven. You know, you kind of touched on it a little. Yeah. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that that's so true. I think that what can be helpful when taken to extreme can turn into something that's harmful. And I think that we're in an environment now with the pandemic that's really forced everyone to kind of step back and say, you know, what's really important and have some level of balance. You know, we're recording this right after the first of the year, and I've seen people posting on social media saying, hey, I'm taking some additional time. You know, I've realized that I need to take some time for me. And I think that that's really important. And so I do think it's important to have that sense of balance. And it's easy to fall into the trap of always thinking you've got to get another degree. You've got to be better. You've got to, you know, be at the absolute top of your class. You can't take a day off. And ultimately, I think that can have a huge mental health toll. And so I think that certainly is important as well.
How does that show up, would you say, in the workplace though? When we, you know, we have this notion that we should be twice as good. We have been twice as good. We've been excelling our whole lives, like you said, you know, top of our class. I have a similar story to your mom, you know, skipping 2 grades and, you know, valedictorian and top of this and leadership awards and you name it. And then I go into the workplace and I'm not received in the same way that I've kind of been conditioned my whole life to kind of expect that the world would treat me. So what would you say for that as well?
I think part of the problem in terms of how that shows up is it starts to normalize a double standard, meaning what's required of me because I'm coming in on Saturdays and Sundays and, you know, working until 8 or 9 and I'm getting all these multiple degrees. And it almost starts creating this double standard where what's required of me is very different than what's required of someone else. And so I think that's one of the ways that it showed up. In fact, literally, I was just on LinkedIn and I saw somebody, it's a white guy actually, who posted this pillow that said, I wish that you could have the confidence of a mediocre white man. And that, you know, just really kind of jumped out at me because I think it goes back to that double standard. It's that when we look at what's required for a promotion, or what's required for this high profile position, or what's required for a certain salary, I don't think that those two oftentimes are equal. And I think that oftentimes we kind of do ourselves a disservice where we kind of get into this mode of always doing twice as much, or always being available, or always working on weekends, or always, giving up vacation, or always, because after a while that becomes the norm. Maybe even though someone else isn't doing it, but for you, if you kind of erase all boundaries and, become a slave, to the job, and, you'll always go above and beyond, then all of a sudden now the bar for you may become higher. And so for me, I saw that inequity a lot of times. And that, to me is really problematic.
What should an equitable leader do then? If an organizational leader wants to address the inequities in the workplace, they know after listening to this podcast, don't forget to click like and subscribe. They know that these are the experiences that we're having, and they want to do something in the workplace to address those inequities in our treatment and the expectations that are put on us. Right. What should they do? What advice would you give?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one, provide opportunities for anonymous, candid feedback. First, you can't fix what you don't know about. And it's certainly a mistake to just assume things are good, or just assume that because nobody is saying anything to you, everyone's happy. So certainly look for opportunities for people to provide that candid feedback, and preferably in some sort of anonymous format. The other thing I would say is, when you were first saying the question to me, I was thinking, well, be fair, create an environment that's really fair. But then, how do you do that? So I'm sure most leaders feel like their environment is pretty fair. So what I would say is go to the data. So, we can argue back and forth all day about whether or not there's equity or fairness, but we can look at the numbers. So look at your numbers. What do your numbers tell you? Are Black people, brown people being brought into the organization at commensurate levels? Are they being represented in leadership in the way, with the numbers that one would expect? What does your supplier program look like? Again, what is the anecdotal feedback that you're getting from staff? So you can pull all this data in, and those numbers will tell you, do you have an issue or do you not have an issue? And if you do, then take steps to really start to work through that. And just one little suggestion, one tangible suggestion, I found that subjectivity is the enemy for many Black and brown people. So if you have processes where there's tons of subjectivity, and that's very common, determining who gets promoted, determining who gets a sponsor, who gets a mentor, determining salary levels, who gets visibility on certain projects, who gets an international assignment, all those types of things. If you can create more objectivity in those processes, that generally tends to create more equity. I even had a situation early in my career where I was a member of a professional organization, and I, was just starting my business, and, I wanted to get more visibility. So I submitted to be a speaker for their local, this was an Atlanta local organization. And I didn't get selected. And I was at a meeting, and I told my friend who's at the meeting, I said, watch, I said, I'm going to submit the same presentation, the same talk to the international group. And she looked at me like I was crazy, because they also had a conference, but it was international, much, much bigger scale. Sure enough, I submitted, I was selected. Wow. And the reason why I expected that was because the local one was just who you knew. I mean, it was a good old boys club. They were a group of people who were much older than me, much whiter than me, people I didn't have much in common with. But when I went to the international process, it was completely blind, completely objective. That doesn't mean it was completely fair. I mean, I'm sure there's opportunity for subjectivity in there as well, but it was a blind RFP process. And with that, I felt I had a much fairer shot. I had an opportunity to really be judged on my capacity and my abilities.
That is so real, but so frightening, because I feel like what you're describing so many years ago is still the current experience of so many people in so many workplaces, where there are these subjective processes, where these decisions are being made, like you said, in these kind of good old boy fashions, where it comes down to likability and personality and quote unquote fit and all these
right.
problematic terms that we don't want employers to be talking about anymore. And so, what do we need to do, I guess, in practical terms, to avoid the situations where we fall into the workplace patterns, the familiarity, who am I bumping my elbows with? They're going to get the opportunity to go on that conference. They're going to be the ones that I'm going to promote because I like them. I think they're going to do well. They're going to work well here. How do we get away from that?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just be completely honest. I think that subjectivity and that, because when you think about success, what really determines, and we have to be careful, but corporate success in terms of promotability, making it, as high as you want to make it, when we define it that way, most of those factors relate to who you know, opportunities, advantage, visibility. Did you get on this high profile project? Not saying you don't have any control, but most of what I've seen is not rocket science. So when it comes down to actual intellect and capacity, I do think that matters, but I don't think it matters as much as some of these other elements. And actually, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this brilliantly in Outliers. If you haven't, not for you, but everybody, if you haven't read Outliers, check that out. Because in that book, he breaks down a lot of these huge outliers in terms of some of the most successful bands and individuals in our society. And he really does the analysis to break down, well, what was it that contributed to that success? And oftentimes we think that it's just, it's the meritocracy myth. It's just our own merit, it's just our own drive, it's our own intellect, it's our own capacity. And what he finds is there are really three major contributors. Yes, your own individual talent and capacity matters, but there are two other major buckets. There's opportunity, what opportunities that these people have that maybe other people didn't have. And then there's just pure advantage. What advantages do some people have? So I think that subjectivity will absolutely always, I think that element of, these other contributors to success, I think they'll always be there and they'll always matter. That's why I think that anti-racism is so important, because it says you have to be working against it. And so that's where I go back to some of the things I talked about before in terms of pulling the data and seeing where you have an actual problem and then kind of reverse engineering it or doing the root cause analysis to say, well, why? That's one of the things that my background's in industrial engineering. So I used to teach like process engineering and root cause analysis. And so one of the techniques is we would start with the problem, and then we would ask why at least 5 times to try to come up with a root cause that really truly would address this one particular problem. One example is I was talking to somebody about why the publishing industry tends to be overwhelmingly white. And they had gone through an activity where they did this root cause analysis, and they found that one of the major reasons was because they tended to have internships that were unpaid. And we all know that internships can become a major pipeline to full-time positions, which become the pipeline to leadership. But a lot of Black and brown people obviously disproportionately can't afford to take an unpaid internship. So just having that type of model can introduce tons of bias into the pipeline.
You're talking about things for me that, raise my background in access and accessibility and fairness. And like you said, with Malcolm Gladwell, who has the access, who has the opportunity to achieve certain things. But it's also leading me to think, there's going to be some skeptics watching, and they're going to say, well, it's not all about the models and the processes and the things. And, that notion that Black women have to work twice as hard and we have all these qualifications and credentials means that we might be lacking some of the kind of social things that that those good old boys look for when they're moving people up. And so they're giving the opportunities to the deserving. What do we say to refute, that notion that, perhaps we're not as good, we're not as deserving. Yes, you might have all the certificates but you're missing that intangible it factor. And so we're bypassing it. What do you say to those skeptics?
Well, I probably don't say a whole lot to those skeptics, because that sounds pretty racist to me. To say, you're just lacking. I mean, you're just not capable. In fact, sometimes when people try to not believe or try to push back on just the concept of systemic racism, I'll pull out the stats around the Fortune 500 CEOs, or even a better one. Why have we never had a Black female governor, in the country? I'm not talking about low numbers. I'm talking about zero.
No.
Why? I'm sorry?
In the United States, you've never had a Black female governor?
Never. We've never had a Black female governor of any state ever. Okay, so that's why my Spelman sister, Stacey Abrams, is trying to make history running for governor. So, I mean, that's one stat. It's an overwhelming stat, but the Fortune 500 CEOs, right now we have 5. Okay, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's 1%, 5 Black, that's men and women, 5 Black total. We have 2 Black females. That is the highest number, I believe the highest number we've ever had, because the only other one was Ursula Burns. There was another woman, Mary Winston, but she wasn't a full-time CEO. She was in a temporary position and was replaced by a white man. So for the entire history of the Fortune 500, for most of the years, there were 0 Black women, none. Okay, we had Ursula Burns, then she was gone for years, and now we have 2. So for all those years where there were 0 Black women who were leading Fortune 500 companies, I asked the question, why is that? That could either be because you think they lack the skill, the intellect, the capacity, which to me is a racist argument. That's kind of the definition of racism. If you think that there's something about their Blackness or womanness that makes them incapable, you think they're not driven or motivated, to me, again, racist, because, why would they not desire that? Or there's something in the system that is making it much more difficult for Black women to reach those levels of leadership. It's not happening by accident.
Despite all our qualifications, despite all our credentials, we are twice as good. We've demonstrated it time and again. And you're right. It's
and let me point out, Ursula Burns was an engineer. She rose up through Xerox as an engineer. So something else we have to be really, really careful with is the organizations that, they've got a Black face and it's their chief diversity officer. Okay. I don't know too many people who move from chief diversity officer to COO or CEO. Okay. So there's also disparity sometimes when you do have 1 or 2 Black people or Black women in particular in those executive leadership or senior leadership positions. But if the only person is the chief diversity officer, then to me, that's a problem as well. So, I just go to, look at the data. The data will pretty much tell the story and let you know if there's an issue or not. Now, if you choose to not see an issue, people believe what they want to believe. Yeah. So I don't spend a whole lot of time, knocking my head up against the wall. So
because we know, like you said, there's the racism that exists in the world and in the thought processes and patterns of these people, it's not going to be done overnight. And those are the ones, though, that are shaping the corporations and those frameworks that get people in the door, that get people these opportunities and access to those opportunities, as you noted from Malcolm Gladwell. So for me, it's like, we have this notion that we work twice as hard and that we're butting that up against this kind of glass ceiling that's laden with racism. And it's how do we get people to kind of dismantle that, to break that ceiling for us so that we can be all that we've been reared to be, literally from childhood.
Yeah, I think that's also another reason why a lot of Black women leave corporate America. I think that Black women are demographically represent a significant percentage of new entrepreneurs every year. And I think that it's because they are, hitting that glass ceiling. And I think you also have to be realistic, and you have to decide, I think some of this comes with age too, where do you want to put your energy? Do you want to continually feel like you're fighting, you're pushing, you're trying to swim upstream? And that's not to say that every environment is toxic or every environment is negative. I actually had fairly good experiences in corporate America. I mean, I could definitely see inequities. Absolutely. But, it's not in any way to just bash every environment or every company or every environment's horrible. I mean, so there are good environments out there. There's a range, but I do think there's a lot of data that also suggests that a lot of Black women in particular just simply choose to leave, or they choose to go back to school and go into, academia, or they choose to do something very, very different. And I think that, it's important to say that as well, that we can't always feel like the burden is on us every single day to change the system. I mean, that's not, oftentimes that's insurmountable. And often, so we have to give ourselves, I think, the grace in order to focus on our span of control. And for many people, that means choosing a different career path or altering or changing, what that career path might look like.
That's fantastic advice. I think you're absolutely right. We don't give ourselves as much grace as we absolutely need to just be content with where we are in our place in the world, to make the gains or strides that we want to make at the time that we want to make them, and without putting those external pressures on ourselves, or the pressures that are kind of passed down through the generations from our family members. But it's interesting how that notion, that your mother had, kind of has also trickled down, right? That, the world is expecting of us to respond in a certain way and to be a certain way. And that is part of that kind of glass ceiling effect, I would say. So what are some of the ways, Dana, that you are currently, I would say, working twice as hard in your life? You've got your business. Tell us a little bit about Professionalism Matters and what you're doing there.
Yeah, so I started my business in 2003. So I think, is that year 19 now I'm coming up on? I cannot believe it. And it was just the best blessing at that point in my life. I had, as I mentioned, a good, really positive career in management consulting, and I was in traditional corporate for a while. But I really enjoy what I'm doing. I go out, I train, I speak, I write. I'm really, really enjoying writing. I know you mentioned my Forbes column, and I've written a couple of courses for LinkedIn Learning. And so I'm really enjoying that as well. In fact, I feel like I'm having my second career now as a writer. And, that's actually kind of interesting as well. I wrote an article for Forbes, what was it, entitled something like 5 secrets, like, dear Black professionals, here are 5 secrets that your white manager may not tell you. And literally, I wrote that article maybe a year ago or so, I don't remember. But in that article, I was recounting an experience that I had in my 20s when I was first working corporate job, where I wrote something, and I was in an engineering organization. I had an engineering background. I had just graduated from Georgia Tech. And my mentor at the time, who was a white guy who was maybe like 5-10 years older than I was, and he kind of rejected it. And he said, "You're using too many big words. People around here, they're not going to get that. You need to dumb it down. You need to, And I, took that and I kind of, dumbed it down. And literally, it wasn't until I'm 50 now. It wasn't until I was 48, 49, somewhere in there, that I ever even considered I'm a good writer. Like, I could actually write professionally. So it's like, now I'm having my whole second career. And it wasn't until I wrote that article that it hit me. I was like, wow, what if he had encouraged me instead of saying you're writing too, high level, you got to dumb it down? What if he said, wow, you're an amazing writer. Have you ever thought about, you could, but it just never occurred to me. And I think that part of that is the legacy, the culture that you see oftentimes in Black families, because for me, I did well in math and engineering. I got a scholarship for math and engineering. I think when they see an opportunity, they push it. They say, oh, math and engineering, do math and engineering. Like, I don't think anybody ever really asked me, do you like math and engineering? Right. Do you want a career in math and engineering? They just said, oh, you can do it, do it. And I feel, even as a parent, I feel myself, when you see aptitude, you kind of have a tendency to push in that direction, but I do think there's this cultural element for Black people because historically we've had so few opportunities that there was that tendency to push, push, push. Um, and as a result of that, as I'm saying in my own personal life, I think that now, much later in my life, I'm starting to actually step back and question and say, well, what do I really want to do? And so I'm really, really enjoying the writing.
That's fantastic. I'm really happy to hear that. And I've been enjoying your writing. I've been following you on LinkedIn and absorbing everything that you have to share because I'm sure as the viewers
Thank
realize you
you.
are a wealth of information. And I thank you again for just, encouraging me to start writing and getting my thoughts out on paper around, some of the experiences that I've had in the workplace. It's really been cathartic to kind of get that out and have and express my views to the world through some of the work that you've been doing. So I appreciate that. And I just want to ask, if people need to connect with you after this conversation, how can they do that? What is your website or your handles?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you. I've so enjoyed talking to you. Best way to contact me is to follow me on LinkedIn and Forbes. Those are the places where I'm most active. So please feel free to reach out, message me on LinkedIn. I do read my messages, but I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you for being a guest. And for those who are watching, please don't forget to click like and subscribe and ring the bell below to receive all the alerts in this fantastic series with amazing scholars and DEI practitioners and anti-racism experts and fantastic writers like Dana. You're going to connect with all of these amazing women through this series, and I hope you've enjoyed watching the show. Thank you again for being a guest.
Thank you, Janelle.